First of all, this is my first trip to Japan, and I'm thrilled and honored to be here. So I wanted to thank you. I've been overwhelmed with the beauty of the country and hospitality of everyone I've met here, and it's a real treat. I do understand that in Japan it's customary to begin talk with an apology, and this is not something I have a lot of experience at, being an American. In the United States, we tend to begin our talks with a joke. So here in Kyoto, I don't know what to do other than apologize that I will not be beginning with a joke today. This talk, thank you. This talk is all in collaboration with Martin Rossball, a professor at the University and a former postdoc of mine, a number of other people, including Jevin West, who's here, Michael Bachman and Mattia Donaldson-Matesi have also been involved in this work. And what I want to tell you about today is really a story of my intellectual hero, John Maynard Smith. He's been my hero since the time I was in high school, and much later in my life became a friend. And what John saw as fundamentally important in evolutionary biology. As many of you may know, John was the recipient of the 2001 Kyoto Prize, perhaps the greatest honor that was bestowed upon him, and then he passed away in 2004 and was very sadly missed. But John understood evolutionary biology fundamentally as science of information and the study of information, and that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about how he proposed that in the landmark paper, how he was attacked for those ideas by the philosophers of biology who tried to criticize that, and about some of my own thoughts about why John was actually right. So let's see, go forward, maybe not. Okay, so John's basic idea, everything in biology is about information. Whether we're looking at animal signals or neural signals or looking at genes and evolution. And John knows that genes carry information. Genes, informational molecules, as he wrote in 2000, that carry coded information from genotype to phenotype. And so his idea was that there's sort of this information channel in biology that takes us from genes to phenotype in that way. And it seems to me that the wonderful question in evolutionary biology is, well, how did that information get there? You got information, and unless you're an American creationist or something of the sort, you might suspect that evolution has something to do with it. And in fact, I do. And I think that explaining exactly what evolution has to do with it and how evolution did it is the answer to the question that your conference raises. What is evolution? As John said, I think obviously you can't sadly come back and tell me I'm misrepresenting him, but I think he would agree. Developmental biology can be seen as the study of how information in the genome is translated into the adult structure, so that's that channel from genotype to phenotype. And evolutionary biology, these are my emphasis, the study of how it came to be there in the first place. And so this raises, once you think about information and evolution, there are all these wonderful questions. And I want to try to, more than anything, rather than trying to impress you that I've done some cool work on it or something like that, I want to convince you that these are exciting questions. These are badly underappreciated in evolutionary biology right now. We need people with the appropriate tools and intellectual ability to come out of physics, and out of engineering, and out of mathematics, and dive into these questions. And that's really the aim of this talk, is to try to persuade you that there's something you can contribute here. These kinds of questions we ask. What are the mathematical laws for how information gets into the genome? How should we measure information in evolutionary biology? What, if anything at all, do evolutionary biologists mean when they talk about there being information in genes, when they're talking about? How does Shannon theory inform our understanding about evolution? Let me just give you some little examples of the first couple of things before I try to move on to Maynard Smith's claim and the attack from the philosophers and so on. What are the mathematical laws for how information gets in the genome? We have these wonderful mathematical laws for population genetics, how allele frequencies change over time. And yet there's sadly little work that's been done on the mathematical laws for how information accumulates in the genome. One of the last really solid things that was done in this area was done by Motomura, who figured out, what does it cost in terms of selection load or substitutional load to put information in the genome, and Figueroa proves, and kind of rephrasing this in my own language, that to put k bits of information into the genome, you're going to have to kill 1 minus a half to the k of the population in an asexual population. Whoops, gone too far. So you can kind of get some intuition for what Kabir is saying here. You know, imagine that you have a single base pair, right? And it's initially random in the population, and you want to set that base pair. And so if you manage to set that base pair in the whole population to big A, then you would have put in 2 bits of information, because of the 4 possibilities, you're going down to 1 possibility. 2 bits of information are going to go in. But in order to do that, you're going to have to kill, or not directly kill, but deny reproductive opportunities to the 3/4 of the population that have something other than a big A thing. So this observation about a relation between what are the laws for how much selection has to occur to put a bit of information into the genome, and the answer is enormous amounts. And so, I kind of describe it as this: for every bit, you think about your genome, you've got this enormous genome, and so much of it is expressing everything that you are, and every bit of information in your genome is purchased in the blood of your ancestors' children. Right? So every bit of information in the genome is in your genome because your ancestors had other children that didn't survive because they got that bit wrong. That's how the information got there. And so this is the implicit message in Kabir's paper. But there's been all too little reevaluation of that kind of extension to sexual populations and so forth. Another wonderful question, this is something I've worked on for years, and I'm not going to talk about it because it gets technical, but how should we measure information in evolutionary biology? There's a dirty secret in evolutionary biology. Pretty much everyone else doing respectable science talks about information in terms of information theory, entropy, mutual information, things like that. But biologists, and that's true of people in neurobiology and so on, evolutionary biologists, we tend to use something borrowed. I don't mean to disparage social sciences, but we use something borrowed from the social sciences as sort of a decision theoretic value of information. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with Shannon theory. Shannon theory is all about what's the volume of information, capacity, how many bits does it take? And this value of information is all about, is it about something useful or not? And in biology, in evolutionary biology, we don't care so much how many bits of information are we talking about. We want to know, what did it do? Did it help me avoid a predator, or did it just tell me something irrelevant? And so we've got apples and oranges. What are the connections? Is there some relation between these different ways that are used to view and measure information? And I'd love to talk about this over drinks or whatever, because this is something I've been stewing about for a very long time, but it's sort of a tangent to this talk. What this talk is really more about is about what evolutionary biologists mean when they talk about information. And because John Maynard Smith said this is a fundamental concept in evolutionary biology. Another great evolutionary biologist, George Williams, comes out and says, Williams is arguing that we should think of information as a fundamental ingredient of the universe, along with mass and energy. And I've got absolutely no idea what he's talking about. That doesn't make any sense to me exactly. I mean, information, what does he mean? Information is actually a fundamental stuff. I don't think there's a formal definition there. And this led the philosophers of biology to get rather frustrated with evolutionary biologists when they say there's information in the genome, and the philosophers of biology are trying to sort of cash that in as sort of maybe the arch villain of my story today. If John is the hero, is Peter Godfrey Smith, another good friend and excellent thinker. But Peter has argued that when biologists talk about information, they're evolutionary biologists and geneticists. They're really not talking about anything well-defined at all, unless they're kind of doing sloppy metaphorical work in their language. Sometimes a metaphorical strategy can be useful. And so what Peter says is, look, when you talk about information in evolutionary biology, all you're doing is pushing sequence properties of the things you're studying to the foreground, and you're pushing chemical properties to the background. And what I mean by that, suppose I want to Sometimes if I want to study DNA and I want to understand how certain things happen, I may need to actually think about the physiochemical structure of DNA molecules. Other times, if I want to study DNA, for example, to infer phylogeny, I don't really need to worry about the physiochemical structure, and I can background up on that and just think about the arbitrary sequence properties, right? Just the genetic sequence. And so Peter says, look, that's all that biologists can possibly be doing when they're talking about information. When they talk about the genome being full of information, they're actually just saying it's a useful strategy to forget about all of this stuff and work with this stuff. It doesn't mean anything else besides that. And I'll tell you something for why he reached that point. And philosophers also took this very, very seriously. John wrote this wonderful Target article in 2000 in Philosophy of Science that has generated a decade of debate and conversation in the philosophy of biology and evolutionary biology about what does it mean to have information in biology. And there are kind of two approaches, or two different views that philosophers have tried to sort of rescue the idea of information in evolutionary biology, and they've decided that both have failed. And I'll show you very, very quickly what they are and why. The first is this notion of a causal sense. And the causal sense of information is just simply the idea that Shannon's information theory gives us descriptive statistics that we can use to study the correlations in the world. So we can take quantities like entropy and joint entropy and relative entropy and Kolbe-Gleiber divergence and mutual information, and we can use these to go in and start to study relations in the world. For example, we can measure the mutual information between genes and phenotype, for example. But there's a problem with this that they quickly point out. If you go to do that, you might say, well, okay, there's information in the genes about the phenotype because there's mutual information there. But you can go through and you can, as you know, mutual information is a symmetric quantity. And so it turns out there's just as much information in the phenotype about the genes as in the genes about the phenotype. And so it doesn't seem to capture the directionality when biologists talk about there's information in the genes. They don't say there's information in the phenotype about the genes. They say there's information in the genes about the phenotype. So this doesn't seem to be doing the trick. Maybe even worse still, you may have already been somewhat disappointed to see me put this up saying, genes generate phenotype. That's not really how it works. Genes and the environment interact to generate phenotype. And why are genes so special? Why should they get all the credit? Why is all the information in the genes? Why don't we say the information's in the environment? And so this is the notion behind the parity thesis, which is just another attack on the idea that you can possibly ground biologists' language of information in kind of Shannon information theory. And so, of course, the parity thesis is based on this. In fact, the heart of the parity thesis is based on this common thing in information theory. The role of source and channel are interchangeable, right? That role of source and channel is just a fact about is a detail of our interest. It's not a fact about the world. So normally we're trying to watch television, and here's the source, and here's the channel, and that's the sort of channel conditions and noise from the thunderstorm. But if the television repairman is out, he's trying to understand what are the sources of interference. He's going to tune it to maybe a static test pattern, and in this case, the sources of interference are his source, the static test pattern, which was our transmitter, is his channel conditions. And so this is reversible. And so using this sort of attack, the philosophers come back and say, well, look, why are you saying that the genes provide the source of the information to the phenotype and the environment, the channel? These things are fully exchangeable. And so the philosophers sort of conclude that if there's anything at all in this causal sense of information, it's only that there's information about the phenotype in the genotype in a very shallow sense that we can say there's information about the presence of fire in the fact that we see smoke. It's simply a causal correlation in the world. There's nothing more going on there. So that effort, which is coming out of maybe a decade of attempts to cash in this Shannon notion of information is deemed a failure by the philosophers. The second effort I'll try to do even more quickly. It's the idea of a semantic sense of information. The reason we say there's information in the genes is because they're representational. They represent something else using a symbolic and arbitrary code. And so Peter, actually agrees. Well, genes indeed represent the amino acids for which they code. I don't think it's quite right. I think we could refine that a little bit more. It's actually genes carry instructional content. They don't represent the amino acids. They carry instructions for building those amino acids, right? So the idea being something we've got, essentially, a recipe doesn't represent a cookie. A recipe carries the information for how to build a cookie. And so we don't have the genes representing the phenotypes that they create. We just have the genes providing us with a little recipe, little coded instructions. And so again, I've taken 1,000 pages of philosophy of biology and stuck it into 10 sentences. So, but that's sort of because of that, the philosophers gave up there. So we're kind of stuck. We've got, on one hand, we've got the eminent evolutionary biologists like George Williams saying what seems to be more or less unabashed nonsense about information as a third stuff along with matter and energy. And then on the other hand, we've got the philosophers of biology saying there's no hope that we can ever cash in any kind of notion of information as any more than sloppy language by evolutionary biologists. And yet, this is core to my thinking. John sees this as, John always saw this as a central thing in biology. There's something missing. Somehow something's missing. So what I'd like to try to do is propose that what's missing is the real heart of what's in what Shannon's information theory is about. Right? Shannon's information theory isn't simply a shallow set of descriptive statistics for measuring correlations. Shannon's information theory is it's a mathematical theory that studies the fundamental limits of compression. How far can we compress sequences before they lose their unique identities? And if we compress them beyond that point, how far are they distorted? And then from that rich mathematical theory emerges this wonderful engineering discipline, the decision theory of I've got to package this information for transport from here to there, and there's some constraints. Maybe I've got some bandwidth constraints. Maybe there's some error in my there's sources of noise to my channels. How do I do that? How do I properly package this information for transport? That's what Shannon's theory is all about, and that's really missing from any of the discussions that we've seen in evolutionary in the philosophy of biology. Well, we might ask ourselves as well, are evolutionary biologists interested in these sorts of issues? And are these sorts of issues of packaging information for transport important in evolution itself? One of the first things to work out is, well, if we've got if we have a notion of genes carrying packaged information, from whom do they carry it, and to whom do they deliver it? Typically, when people have tried to work this out, and John did this as well, and I think I firmly believe if he'd had more time to respond, he would have handled this in a different way. But John always tried to set up a parallel between this picture of genes and environment leading to phenotype and Shannon's famous diagram of a channel running in that way. And that's really not what I see when I look at this. The reason I don't see that is that there's no real transmission here. This is a decoder. This is just this stage over here to the right? It's not getting packaged and carried anywhere. This is just the last piece where we've arrived. If the information has arrived, we decode it, if you will. And so, and I feel like somehow we need to figure out where actually is the information going. Who's carrying the information from whom? Part of the problem is that in evolutionary biology, we set up our mathematics and with them are thinking metaphors in ways that sort of suppress our thinking about that question. And the reason that evolution, Darwin was able to formulate evolutionary theory, and the reason that what happens, well, they turn red, and how fast will it happen, and will it happen for sure? And we've heard some lovely talks today that have delved into that kind of analysis a little bit already, which is terrific. But it's very hard as we think about population to population to population. It's very hard to see what's the information that's being packaged, who's sending what to whom. And so what I want to do is to provide you with an alternative metaphor. Instead of thinking of natural selection, the environment sorting on populations of beetles, I want to tell you a really different story, and that you could use to maybe think about how information is packaged for transmission, and about how evolution works. It's a story well, I guess I'll just dive in and tell the story. So you can imagine that you go to a avant-garde performance, sort of a dance performance, and you're sitting in a dark room, there's a dark stage, and the curtain rises, and there's a dancer there on the stage, and the dancer wakes and looks around her, and it's clear that she has no idea what she's doing on the stage, and she doesn't really know who she is, and she's confused. She wakes up and she kind of rises to her feet and starts to explore the stage, and try to figure out, what am I doing here? Who am I? What am I supposed to, what's the purpose of all of this? What's going on? What's happening? And as she walks around, finally at the left of the stage, she finds a letter on the floor. She finds this envelope, and she picks up the envelope, opens up the envelope, and takes out a number of folded sheets of paper. And this newly born dancer, lies down and begins to read. And she pulls out the first sheet, and the first says, my beloved daughter, I'll never meet you, but I'm your mother, and I have some advice for you about the world that you have been born into, and how to be successful here in this world. And then the letter goes through this whole list of advice, and it says, be sure to wear your rain boots and take an umbrella, and don't take men that drive pickup trucks. And it goes kind of on and on through these sorts of things. And it's quite nice. It's this wonderful set of advice about all this information about how to be successful in the world. And it's just really refreshing to the dancer. And so she rises and almost, ecstatic, because now it's been solved. What is she to do here in this world? But then she realizes there's a second sheet of paper. She reads the second sheet of paper, and it says, my dear daughter, you might ask how I know these things that I'm telling you. Well, I don't. In fact, I've just woken myself, much as I imagine you have, a few seconds ago on a blank and empty land. And I found a little letter waiting for me. It's got all this advice in it. I don't know if any of it's true or not, but I'm just copying it. I'm sure I'm making mistakes, but I'm just copying the advice that I received from my own parent, and I'll pass it along to you. Probably in my life, I'll figure out whether the advice is right or wrong, but it'll be too late. By then, the letter will have been written and signed and sealed. But in any case, it's what I can send you, and so it is what I will send you. No experience from my own lifetime, but just this letter that I found here. In fact, behind my letter, you'll find a number of sheets of paper. Please take those and write those, and on each sheet, write your own letter to your own daughters, if you're fortunate enough to have any. I know, how would you know what to write? Well, you can copy my letter if you like. You can change it if you will. In any case, sign it, seal it, and then go out and explore the world. And that's my story of Darwin's dancer. You can see this is a metaphor for how information passes through the generations, at least through asexual generations, in a world that is non-monarchic, in a Darwinian world. The parents don't get to pass on any acquired characters or any acquired information through the genome, right? The genome is written once the parent is born, right? And so what a strange way, if you will, to try to build a system to learn about the world. I mean, how many of you, if I asked you to design a learning algorithm, would come up with one where the learning algorithm made a bunch of guesses about stuff, and then went through the entire experience period and wasn't allowed to write any of that down. A very strange way to run a world, and so it raises all of these natural questions about, well, how is it that evolution by natural selection can work in this context? How does it go about acquiring the information? We'll come back to those in just a moment. I think you probably see many of the answers already yourselves from your own understanding of evolution. But first, I think now we can answer some of the questions, at least. Information packaged by whom for transmission to whom. And previously we were talking about this sort of decoding from genes to phenotype. The transmission here becomes quite clear through our metaphor. It's the transmission down along the generations. Information that we talk about in genetics and evolutionary biology is information that's been packaged for transport down through the generations in the genes. And this already starts to resolve some of the critiques that a philosopher might raise. I've got some formal definitions here to try to make philosophers happy. We talk about a transmission sense of information. Object Z conveys information, and the function of Z is to reproduce by virtue of its sequence properties. Uncertainty on the part of an agent who receives Z. But the point, you see the point. The transmission sense of information. Something is information if its job is, if its function is to reduce uncertainty, if it's packaged and sent, and its function is to reduce uncertainty on the part of the receiver. And when we go and we look at DNA, the DNA just screams that that's its job. Think about it, it's incredibly compact. We don't have any kind of storage technology that can compress information, so much information into such a tiny space. It's remarkably stable. DNA doesn't have any other job, right? It's essentially inert. Just take Lewontin points out. I'm stretching it, but it doesn't interact. It doesn't do the work in the cell, right? It's not the interactor in the cell. It's just there holding the information. It's infinitely extensible. It's this combinatorial form of symbolic language that you can write anything, if you will, in the DNA. And it's so incredibly replicable. What a wonderful thing. DNA is made so that it can be easily copied. Its double helical structure makes it so easy to make copies. Imagine you wanted to copy your hard disk, and you could throw it in a water bath and put it through a few thermal cycles, and out would pop millions and millions of identical hard disks. Well, that's how PCR works, right? I mean, DNA is amazing in terms of all of these things. So you're looking at its structure, its function, so clearly is exactly this. There are little. We were worried earlier about this symmetry between mutual information. And mutual information between genome and environment is the same. I'll skip that actually. Let's skip that. Let's go and go on to the parity. This kind of parity complaint. So with the parity thesis is arguing, well, you can't say the genes have the information and the environment doesn't. But what's being packaged for transport? What is it that's being passed along? The environment isn't packaged for transport, at least in the initial basic neo-Darwinian model. As we go to some of these more interesting niche construction cases that we were discussing today, there may be serious elements in which the environment is manipulated and it's self-transforming. But in our basic neo-Darwinian framework, it is the genes that are transported generation upon generation upon generation. What's channel and what's source and what's channel? This is no longer a fact about my interests per se. This is a fact about what natural selection is able to operate on. Because to be able to operate on something, that something needs to be heritable. This is what's heritable, and so this breaks our parity argument. And we can sort of look at a more refined model of where does that information get in, and just think back to Chimera, of course. We don't have just a single unbroken, and I've got 10, is that right? Great. We don't just have a single unbroken linear chain of transmission events, but as I've been showing, but rather, of course, the parent with the genes will produce a number of sets of genes, a number of possible offspring, and some will be good and some won't be good because of copying errors, and the ones that aren't so good maybe are lost, and the ones that are more successful continue, and the pattern repeats through evolutionary time. And it's with, back to Kimura, it's with the loss of each of these that the information, mutual information builds up between what works well and what's actually encoded in the genome, right? So we can go back and now we can look at our dancer story. Why should the advice in the letter be any good? Well, the advice in the letter should be any good in part because your mother couldn't have gotten too bad of advice, or else she wouldn't have had you, right? And so as long as she copied it fairly faithfully, the advice might be fairly reasonable. And by this kind of process of build-up that we've been talking about, why should the advice in the letter be any good? Well, it's because there's been, all these little subtle copying errors. The ones that aren't any good are weeded out by the selection process. The ones that are better are continued in that letter. As the process is the outcome of this long process of now over 3 billion years of adaptive evolution. You can see these little things that aren't so obvious without this story. I mean, we don't see this when we look at the population genetic view. We can say, well, how fast can you acquire information by natural selection? And notice in my story, there's absolutely, suppose that after the mother is born, the environment changes. So the mother's born, it's good to wear blue shoes. And then the environment changes, and now you need to have black shoes. And so how does she tell her daughter this? And the answer is there's no way for her to sneak a message, right? When she's born, the letters are already signed and sealed. So she can tell her, she may be able to sneak a message to her granddaughters, get a message to her granddaughters that you should have blue shoes. How does she do that? Well, she makes some daughters, some with blue shoes, some with black shoes, and now I've already forgotten which color you're supposed to be, but the color, the successful color survives, and then the granddaughters, because of that variation in their parental generation, are all receiving the best advice. But there's no way, in this non-Lamarckian mechanism for asexuals to get information through right away. What does information cost? We can see this view of, we can again see Kimura's result in this story. If the mother isn't sure whether you should have blue shoes or black shoes, she's going to have to write down 2 letters, one that says blue and one that says black, and she's going to have to live with the fact that one of her 2 daughters is never going to have a chance in life because she's got the wrong color shoes. That's the cost, right? It's the cost of getting this information into the genome. And we can see really cute things like, I'd never seen this, in evolutionary biology. Was there a way to sneak a message? I'm talking about the mother wants to sneak a message to the child. Well, she's asexual, she can't. She wants to say, look, you really should wear blue shoes, not black shoes, but she can't. But as soon as you go to sexual reproduction, well, she can't rewrite her own letter, but she does get to choose her mate. And so if all of a sudden blue shoes are the right things to have, that's something that's changed since she was born. All of a sudden blue shoes are the right things to have. She can go find a mate that's wearing blue shoes, because his letter, pre-written, presumably says, wear your blue shoes. And so actually, one thing that sexual reproduction does is it quickens the response time, right? It allows the mother, by her choice of mate, by sexual selection, to get information about changes that have occurred within her lifetime to the offspring. So, this sort of notion that, well, you should believe my letter because I survived and because your dad was cute. And this is something I just hadn't seen because I was always using this population perspective instead of this individual transmission perspective. So, I mean, I could go on and on and on. There's many, many interesting places that this goes. We've got a banquet that we need to go to, and that will be a lot more fun than listening to me. But, here, I guess I just wanted to reiterate, we've got this question, what is evolution? We've got a lot of views of what is evolution, but I do want to stress that I believe the absolutely central question in evolutionary biology, one that we need people to help us work on, because we're not doing it in biology, is this question: how does information about the world accumulate in the genome by the process of evolution. This is what John Maynard Smith felt was a fundamental issue, maybe the fundamental issue in evolutionary theory, and I agree with him, and I really love your help in proving John correct. Thank you.